Lou Pearlman built boy bands like NSYNC and Backstreet Boys, and a $300 million Ponzi scheme. While shaping pop music, he scammed investors with fake companies, funding his lavish lifestyle. When it all unraveled, Pearlman fled, but was caught, convicted, and died in prison. This is the shocking rise and fall of a music mogul turned fraudster. If you're into uncovering shocking true crime stories like this one, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the most fascinating cases. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Lou Pearlman was born in New York City in 1954, growing up in a working-class family. His early fascination with aviation began with his cousin Art Garfunkel, from the musical duo Simon and Garfunkel, who introduced him to the world of show business and fame. Pearlman was initially captivated by airships and blimps, dreaming of becoming a prominent figure in aviation. He attended Queens College, where he studied business, laying the groundwork for his entrepreneurial ambitions. In the late 1970s, Pearlman started his first business venture, Airship Enterprises, leasing blimps to companies for advertising purposes. His early efforts in aviation were relatively small scale, but he managed to land contracts with several prominent companies, including MetLife. However, these ventures never quite achieved lasting success, with many of his projects falling through due to poor business management and unrealistic financial expectations. Despite these setbacks, Pearlman remained determined to succeed, constantly seeking new opportunities. In the early 1990s, Pearlman shifted his focus from aviation to the entertainment industry. He formed Transcontinental Records in Orlando, Florida, inspired by the massive success of the boy band New Kids on the Block. Pearlman saw a lucrative opportunity in managing boy bands and building his own empire within the music industry. His vision was to create a formula for pop groups that would combine catchy music, synchronized choreography, and the image of clean-cut young men appealing to a wide teenage audience. Pearlman's first major success came with the creation of the Backstreet Boys in 1993. He held auditions and assembled a group of 5 young men, carefully selecting each member to fit the image he wanted to project. The group was initially more popular in Europe, where they achieved chart-topping hits and gained a massive fan base. By 1997, they had broken through in the U.S. with the release of their self-titled album, which included hits like Quit Playing Games with My Heart and As Long as You Love Me. The Backstreet Boys would go on to become one of the best-selling boy bands of all time, selling over 100 million records worldwide. Following the success of the Backstreet Boys, Pearlman quickly capitalized on the growing demand for boy bands. In 1995, he formed NSYNC, another pop group that followed a similar formula. Like the Backstreet Boys, NSYNC initially found success in Europe before exploding onto the U.S. music scene with their debut album in 1998. Hits like I Want You Back and Tearing Up My Heart made them instant stars. By the time their sophomore album, No Strings Attached, was released in 2000, NSYNC had solidified themselves as pop royalty, with the album breaking sales records by selling over 2.4 million copies in its first week. With the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC dominating the charts, Lou Pearlman became one of the most powerful figures in the music industry. He had successfully tapped into a cultural phenomenon, creating 2 of the most iconic boy bands of the 1990s and early 2000s. His ability to manage these groups, control their branding, and market them effectively made him a household name in the world of pop music. Pearlman's growing influence extended beyond just music. He began branching out into other entertainment ventures, including television and merchandise, further expanding the reach of his brand. His success with boy bands not only revolutionized pop music, but also established Orlando as a key hub for the entertainment industry, drawing aspiring musicians and performers to the city. Despite his public image as a successful and innovative music mogul, behind the scenes, Pearlman's business practices were far from clean. As his influence and wealth grew, So did his appetite for power and control. While managing the boy bands that were shaping a generation of pop culture, Pearlman's fraudulent activities were quietly building. However, at this point in his career, those illicit actions remained largely hidden, with his reputation in the music industry seemingly untouchable. Lou Pearlman's Ponzi scheme began to take shape in the late 1980s, long before his rise to fame in the music industry. At the center of his fraudulent empire were two key entities: Transcontinental Airlines and the Transcontinental Savings Program. Pearlman created these companies, positioning them as lucrative investment opportunities with high potential returns. He claimed that Transcontinental Airlines was a successful charter airline company, offering private jet services and blimp advertising with growing revenues and assets. Pearlman portrayed himself as an expert in both aviation and business, leveraging the appearance of success in these ventures to attract investors. He fabricated an entire narrative around Transcontinental Airlines, producing falsified financial statements, fake insurance policies, and fraudulent reports from supposed auditors. These documents falsely indicated that the company owned a fleet of aircraft and had millions of dollars in assets which were entirely fictional. The Transcontinental Airlines that Pearlman advertised to investors simply did not exist. In reality, the investments Pearlman solicited were never used to purchase aircraft or grow his business. Instead, they were funneled into his personal accounts to support his lavish lifestyle. He used the funds to purchase mansions, luxury cars, private jets, and fund extravagant vacations. To maintain the appearance of success and keep the Ponzi scheme running, Pearlman paid off earlier investors with the money he collected from new ones. As long as new investments kept coming in, the scheme appeared to be working, and Pearlman was able to delay the collapse. Despite the seemingly guaranteed high returns, there were early warning signs that something was amiss. For years, several investors and financial institutions noticed inconsistencies in Pearlman's business dealings. Auditors who examined Transcontinental Airlines' financial statements raised concerns about the lack of transparency and the authenticity of the documents Pearlman provided. Yet these warnings were largely ignored, either because investors were blinded by the success of Pearlman's ventures in the music industry, or because they believed in the false security of the savings program. Over the years, as more money flowed into Pearlman's companies, the scale of the fraud grew exponentially. At its peak, Pearlman's Ponzi scheme was worth over $300 million, making it one of the largest financial frauds in U.S. history. He defrauded thousands of individuals, many of whom were retirees who invested their life savings, as well as large institutional investors who never saw the red flags until it was too late. At the center of his lavish spending were his luxury properties. Pearlman owned multiple homes, but the crown jewel of his collection was a massive mansion in Orlando, Florida, known as the Chateau Lou Pearlman. This sprawling estate featured grandiose architecture, lavish interiors, and state-of-the-art amenities, all designed to project the image of success and wealth. The mansion became a symbol of Pearlman's public persona, a place where he hosted parties, business meetings, and events. These properties, funded entirely by investor money, were a stark contrast to the financial ruin many of his investors would eventually face. By 2006, Lou Pearlman's Ponzi scheme was beginning to crack under the weight of its own lies. For years, Pearlman had maintained an elaborate web of deceit, successfully convincing banks, investors, and even government agencies that his businesses were legitimate. However, as the demand for payouts increased and new investments slowed, cracks started to appear in Pearlman's carefully constructed facade. The first signs of trouble surfaced when several investors and financial institutions began asking questions about their investments in Transcontinental Airlines and the Transcontinental Savings Program. Up until this point, Pearlman had managed to keep his investors satisfied by using new investor money to pay off earlier investors, a hallmark of any Ponzi scheme. But as the number of new investors began to dwindle, so did Pearlman's ability to keep up with the promised returns. The unraveling of Pearlman's scheme began when a group of investors became increasingly suspicious about the lack of transparency in Pearlman's financial statements. Banks that had previously lent money to Pearlman's businesses started to notice irregularities in the financial reports he submitted. Requests for detailed financial audits and more in-depth documentation were ignored or met with incomplete information. This raised red flags as legitimate businesses, especially those handling large amounts of investor money, are expected to provide thorough and transparent financial statements. Pearlman had long relied on falsified financial documents to maintain his schemes. He had created fake insurance certificates that claimed his businesses were insured for millions of dollars, giving investors a false sense of security. Additionally, he used fabricated financial statements to show that his companies, particularly transcontinental airlines, were profitable and held significant assets. These documents were often verified by a fake accounting firm that Pearlman himself had created. He even went as far as creating fake people to sign off on these documents, adding layers to the deception. However, as more investors pushed for detailed audits and accurate information, the cracks in Pearlman's story widened. In 2006, an official audit was requested by a group of financial institutions, which led to the discovery of glaring discrepancies in Pearlman's businesses. Auditors quickly realized that many of the assets Pearlman claimed to own didn't exist, and the supposed income from transcontinental airlines was entirely fabricated. There were no fleets of planes, no contracts with major airlines, and no revenue being generated from the airline sector at all. As these revelations came to light, several whistleblowers, including former employees and business partners, stepped forward to expose Pearlman's fraudulent practices. Some of these individuals had long suspected that Pearlman's businesses were not what they appeared to be, but had remained silent due to fear of retaliation or loss of employment. However, as the evidence of fraud became overwhelming, they began to speak out, providing critical information to authorities and investors alike. These whistleblowers provided valuable insight into the inner workings of Pearlman's operations. They revealed how Pearlman had used his music industry success to maintain the illusion of wealth and legitimacy, allowing him to continue deceiving investors for years. They also exposed the extensive network of shell companies Pearlman had created to hide his fraud, making it more difficult for auditors and regulators to uncover the truth. By early 2007, the scope of Pearlman's Ponzi scheme had become too large to ignore. The federal government launched an official investigation into Pearlman's businesses, uncovering the full extent of his fraud. Investigators found that he had defrauded over 1,700 individuals and institutions, stealing more than $300 million over the course of 2 decades. Banks and pension funds were among his largest victims, with many losing millions of dollars in what they had believed to be safe, high-return investments. One of the key elements in the investigation was the realization that Pearlman's scheme was built almost entirely on trust and reputation. His success in the music industry had made it easier for him to gain the confidence of investors, who believed that a man who managed major acts like NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys could be trusted with their money. This reputation allowed him to keep his scheme going for far longer than most Ponzi schemes typically last. In early 2007, as his Ponzi scheme began to unravel and authorities closed in, Lou Pearlman made the decision to flee the United States. Faced with an impending investigation that would soon reveal the full scale of his fraudulent activities, Pearlman knew his time was running out. In a desperate attempt to avoid arrest and prosecution, he quickly liquidated whatever assets he could and disappeared. Pearlman's flight from the U.S. was calculated but hastily executed. He left behind his Orlando mansion and other properties, slipping away without much notice. He traveled through several countries in an effort to evade law enforcement, relying on his ability to blend in with tourists and avoid detection. Over the next several months, Pearlman would hop between different countries, including Germany and Israel, all while continuing to dodge authorities. One of the reasons Pearlman was able to stay hidden for a time was his use of fake identities. Throughout his time as a fugitive, he relied on forged passports and false identification documents. These fake identities allowed him to move across borders without drawing too much attention to himself, making it harder for investigators to track his whereabouts. Pearlman's familiarity with forging documents, a skill he had perfected during his Ponzi scheme, now became his primary tool for survival on the run. By mid-2007, Pearlman had settled in Indonesia, specifically in the tourist city of Bali. In Indonesia, he maintained a low profile, posing as a German businessman under the name A. Incognito Johnson. He rented a modest apartment and attempted to blend in with the local expatriate community. Although Pearlman had once lived in luxury, his life as a fugitive was far more subdued. He avoided the extravagant lifestyle that had once defined him, knowing that any public attention could lead to his capture. Despite his efforts to stay hidden, authorities were closing in. Pearlman's time on the run attracted international attention, and his face appeared on law enforcement bulletins around the world. The FBI, working alongside international law enforcement agencies, had placed Pearlman on their most wanted list. His fraudulent activities had harmed thousands of investors, many of whom were pushing for justice. The scale of his financial crimes meant that his arrest was a high priority for both U.S. authorities and those in countries where Pearlman was suspected of hiding. Pearlman's eventual capture came through a combination of persistence and luck on the part of investigators. In June 2007, he was recognized by a German tourist staying at the same hotel in Bali. The tourist had seen Pearlman's image on an FBI wanted poster, which had been widely circulated online and through various media outlets. Suspicious of his true identity, the tourist reported him to local authorities, who quickly acted on the tip. Indonesian police arrested Pearlman on June 14, 2007, at a luxury hotel in Bali. At the time of his arrest, Pearlman reportedly showed no resistance, perhaps recognizing that his time on the run had come to an end. His capture marked the conclusion of several months of international manhunt efforts. With his arrest, the focus shifted to his extradition back to the United States, where he would face charges related to the massive Ponzi scheme he had orchestrated. Following his arrest, Pearlman was held in an Indonesian detention facility while U.S. authorities prepared the necessary legal paperwork for his extradition. The process was relatively swift, given the severity of the charges he faced and the international cooperation in bringing him to justice. Within weeks, Pearlman was extradited to the United States, where he was immediately taken into custody by federal authorities. He was charged with multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering, facing the consequences of decades of deceit. Upon his return to the U.S., Pearlman was formally charged with conspiracy, money laundering, and bankruptcy fraud. The charges were the result of his 2-decade-long Ponzi scheme, during which he had defrauded more than 1,700 investors out of approximately $300 million. Among those defrauded were individual investors, banks, and pension funds. These charges carried severe penalties, as they reflected not only the financial damage Pearlman had caused, but also the elaborate methods he used to deceive his victims. The court proceedings began in 2008, with Pearlman's trial taking place in federal court in Orlando, Florida. The prosecution's case was straightforward and backed by overwhelming evidence. Investigators presented documents that showed how Pearlman had fabricated entire companies, created fake financial statements, and used fraudulent insurance certificates to convince investors to trust him. The prosecution also highlighted how Pearlman had used investor funds to finance his extravagant lifestyle, which included luxury properties, private jets, and expensive cars, rather than investing the money as promised. In his defense, Pearlman claimed that he had intended to repay the investors and that the business had merely failed. He presented himself as a businessman who had made poor financial decisions rather than someone who had intentionally set out to defraud people. However, the evidence against him was too strong. The prosecution pointed to the fact that Pearlman had falsified documents for years and created a complex network of shell companies which indicated premeditation and intent to deceive. Pearlman's flight from the U.S. also undermined his defense, as it suggested he was aware of his wrongdoing and had attempted to escape the consequences. In May 2008, after a thorough trial, Lou Pearlman was convicted on charges of conspiracy, money laundering, and bankruptcy fraud. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. The court offered Pearlman the opportunity to reduce his sentence if he could recover a portion of the stolen funds for his victims. For every $1 million he repaid, his sentence would be reduced by 1 month. However, Pearlman never managed to recover any significant amount of the stolen money, and many of the victims were left with little to no restitution. During the trial, several of Pearlman's victims provided testimony, expressing their devastation and frustration. Many of these individuals had invested their life savings or retirement funds in Pearlman's fraudulent schemes, believing they were safe and secure investments. Retirees in particular were hit hard, with many stating that they had lost everything. Some victims described how they trusted Pearlman because of his success in the music industry, while others admitted they were swayed by his promises of high returns and low risk. Their stories painted a heartbreaking picture of financial ruin and the long-lasting effects of Pearlman's crimes on their lives. One such victim was a man named Alan Grossman, a retiree who had invested his entire life savings with Pearlman. Grossman described the moment he realized his money was gone as devastating, saying it was as if the ground had fallen out from under him. He, like many others, had believed that Pearlman's connections to the music industry and his high-profile success made the investment safe. But when the Ponzi scheme fell apart, Grossman lost everything, forcing him to take on part-time work just to stay afloat in his later years. Other individual investors, including small business owners and middle-class families, were similarly affected. Some of them had been lured in by Pearlman's claims of being a financial genius, while others were seduced by the seemingly trustworthy nature of his investment programs. These investors would later discover that their money had not been invested in legitimate ventures, but had instead funded Pearlman's extravagant personal lifestyle. Both NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys, the two boy bands that Pearlman had propelled to stardom, eventually sued him for breach of contract. Initially, Pearlman presented himself as a mentor and father figure to these young musicians, claiming to have their best interests at heart. However, as the bands grew more successful, the members realized they were receiving only a small fraction of the revenue their music was generating. Pearlman had structured the contracts in such a way that he took an enormous percentage of their earnings, while the bands were left with a meager amount. NSYNC's lawsuit was particularly high profile. The band's members claimed that despite their overwhelming success, they were earning next to nothing compared to what Pearlman was taking. When the members confronted Pearlman about the situation, they discovered that he had positioned himself as the sixth member of the band in financial terms, taking an equal share of the profits while contributing nothing to the performances. The lawsuit ultimately resulted in NSYNC breaking free from Pearlman's control, but not before enduring a lengthy and stressful legal battle. The Backstreet Boys also went through a similar process, fighting for years to reclaim the earnings they felt had been unfairly taken by Pearlman. Lou Pearlman's life behind bars was far removed from the lavish, high-profile existence he had once enjoyed. Sentenced to 25 years in federal prison after being convicted of conspiracy, money laundering, and bankruptcy fraud, Pearlman faced a much different reality in prison. His health, already deteriorating prior to his imprisonment, continued to worsen as he served his sentence. Pearlman reportedly struggled with heart problems, diabetes, and obesity. conditions that were compounded by the stress of his incarceration. During his time in prison, Pearlman attempted to reduce his sentence by offering to help recover some of the money lost in his Ponzi scheme. The court had ruled that for every $1 million Pearlman returned to his victims, his sentence could be reduced by 1 month. However, despite his promises, Pearlman was never able to recover any substantial amount of the stolen funds, leaving his victims without restitution and his sentence intact. On August 19, 2016, Pearlman died in federal prison at the age of 62. The cause of death was complications related to his ongoing heart problems. He passed away at the Federal Correctional Institution in Miami, Florida, where he had spent the final years of his life. His death marked the end of a long and controversial chapter in both the music industry and financial crime history. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting and want to see more deep dives into true crime and the world of entertainment, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support helps us bring you more great content.